October the 4th, 1943. The grey waters of the Norwegian Sea churned beneath the flight deck of USS Ranger as the first light of dawn broke over the Arctic Circle. Lieutenant Commander Eugene E. Lindsay stood in the cockpit of his Grumman TBF-1 Avenger, running through his final pre-flight checks. The massive radial engine of the torpedo bomber rumbled to life, its Wright R-2600 Cyclone producing a deep, throaty roar that echoed across the carrier deck. Behind him, 9 more Avengers prepared for launch, their crews strapping in for what would become the only United States Navy carrier operation north of the Arctic Circle during the entire war. The mission was Operation Leader, a daring strike against German shipping in the harbour of Bodø, Norway. Intelligence reports indicated that critical iron ore shipments, vital to the Nazi war machine, were being moved through Norwegian waters. The convoys had to be stopped. As Lindsay's Avenger lurched forward from the catapult, climbing into the cold morning air, he couldn't have known that this mission would demonstrate the true versatility of an aircraft that had entered combat just 16 months earlier as what many considered a death trap. The story of the TBF Avenger is not one of immediate triumph. It's a story of redemption, of an aircraft that survived a catastrophic combat debut to become the most effective submarine killer and most widely used torpedo bomber of World War II. It's the story of how American industrial might and engineering adaptation transformed a portly, ungainly-looking aircraft into a weapon that would sink 30 submarines, help destroy the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, and fundamentally alter the nature of naval warfare. The Avenger didn't win respect through elegance or speed. It earned it through sheer toughness, adaptability, and the ability to absorb punishment that would have torn lesser aircraft apart. In the late 1930s, the United States Navy faced a problem. Their standard torpedo bomber, the Douglas TBD Devastator, had entered service in 1937 as a revolutionary aircraft. It was the Navy's first all-metal monoplane torpedo bomber, featuring an enclosed cockpit and retractable landing gear. But aviation technology was advancing at a breakneck pace. By 1939, the Devastator was already showing its age. Its top speed of barely 200 miles per hour made it vulnerable to enemy fighters. Its weak defensive armament offered little protection. Most critically, it carried its torpedo externally, creating enormous drag that further reduced its already marginal performance. The Navy knew they needed a replacement, and they needed it fast. In April 1940, the Navy issued specifications for a new torpedo bomber. They wanted something revolutionary, a top speed of 300 miles per hour, an internal torpedo bay to reduce drag, a range of 3,000 miles, defensive armament that could actually defend. The contract went to Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation, a company that had already proven itself with the F-4F Wildcat fighter. Chief designer Leroy Grumman and his team went to work on what would be designated the XTBF-1. What emerged from Grumman's Bethpage, New York plant was something unlike anything the Navy had seen before. The prototype that first flew on August 7, 1941 was massive. At 40 feet long with a wingspan of 54 feet, it dwarfed its predecessor. But it was the aircraft's girth that really caught attention. With its bulbous fuselage designed to accommodate a large internal bomb bay, the TBF looked, as one pilot would later describe it, like a Wildcat fighter that had swallowed a truck. The resemblance to the smaller Wildcat wasn't coincidental. Grumman had leveraged their existing fighter design to accelerate development, giving the torpedo bomber similar lines, the same rearward folding wing mechanism, and a family resemblance that was unmistakable. Escort carrier sailors would later nickname it the Turkey because of its size and relatively ponderous handling compared to nimble fighters. The comparison wasn't entirely flattering, but the name stuck. Under the capacious fuselage sat the heart of the machine, the Wright R-2600 twin Cyclone, a 14-cylinder radial engine producing 1,700 horsepower in early models, and eventually 600 horsepower in later variants. This was power on a scale that pushed the boundaries of single-engine aircraft design. The engine drove a massive 3-bladed propeller that seemed almost comically oversized. Everything about the TBF was big, and that size would prove to be both its greatest challenge and its ultimate strength. The aircraft carried a crew of 3, separated by the massive radio equipment that filled the greenhouse canopy behind the pilot. The pilot sat alone in the forward cockpit with no direct access to the rest of the aircraft's interior. Behind him, crammed into a space packed with radio gear, sat the radio man bombardier, who also operated a ventral machine gun firing rearward from a position just aft of the weapons bay. In the aft section of the long canopy sat the turret gunner, manning an electrically powered turret that was itself a minor marvel of engineering. Previous attempts at powered turrets in this position had failed because manual and hydraulic systems were too slow and unreliable. Grumman's electrically powered turret could traverse and elevate fast enough to track contemporary fighters, a critical capability that would save countless lives. The weapons bay itself was the TBF's defining feature. Large enough to hold a 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo, it could alternatively carry a single 2,000-pound bomb or up to 4 500-pound bombs. Later in the war, provisions were added for rockets, drop tanks, and even specialized anti-submarine weapons. This adaptability would prove crucial as the Avengers' role evolved far beyond its original torpedo bomber mission. Armament for early models consisted of a single 30 caliber machine, gun in the nose, the 50 caliber gun in the dorsal turret, and another 30 caliber ventral gun. Pilots quickly complained that this forward armament was woefully inadequate, lacking range, hitting power, and volume of fire. In response, Grumman developed the TBF-1C variant, which replaced the nose gun with two 50 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings, dramatically improving the aircraft's offensive capabilities. The Navy was so desperate for the new torpedo bomber that they placed an order for 286 aircraft in December 1940, months before the prototype even flew. This was an extraordinary vote of confidence, or perhaps an indication of just how badly the Devastator needed replacing. Production began in early 1942, and by the spring the first operational aircraft were reaching fleet squadrons. The timing seemed perfect. The Navy was expanding rapidly after Pearl Harbor, and new carriers were joining the fleet. The TBF would be there to equip them. On the afternoon of December 7, 1941, Grumman held a ceremony to open a new manufacturing plant and display the new TBF to the public. The timing was, of course, catastrophic. Even as Grumman executives were showing off their new torpedo bomber to the assembled press and dignitaries, Japanese aircraft were attacking Pearl Harbor. When word reached the ceremony, the plant was immediately sealed off against possible sabotage. The attack that brought America into the war also gave the TBF its name. It would be called the Avenger. By early June 1942, Torpedo Squadron 8, embarked aboard the carrier USS Hornet, had finally received their new Avengers. But the timing was cruel. When Hornet departed Norfolk for the Pacific to join the fleet before the Battle of Midway, only half the squadron made the departure. The other half, consisting mostly of newly commissioned ensigns, remained behind to work up the new aircraft. They flew the TBFs across the country to San Diego, then shipped aboard transport vessels to Pearl Harbor, hoping to rejoin their carrier before the battle. They arrived on May 29th. Hornet had sailed the day before. 6 of the TBF-1s were quickly loaded aboard another transport and rushed to Midway Island as part of a desperate attempt to reinforce the tiny atoll's air defences. Lieutenant Langdon K. Fieberling led the small detachment, and most of his pilots had never flown out of sight of land before. Many had less than 100 hours in the Avenger. They were about to enter combat against the most experienced carrier-striking force in the world. On the morning of June 4, 1942, as Japanese carriers approached Midway, every available American aircraft on the island scrambled to attack. The 6 Avengers took off at 6 a.m., part of a motley strike force that included obsolete Marine Corps dive bombers, Army B-26 medium bombers hastily fitted with torpedoes, and the remaining Douglas Devastators. What followed was a slaughter. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol consisted of dozens of Mitsubishi A6M Zero fighters, arguably the finest carrier fighter in the world at that time. The American torpedo bombers, forced to fly low and slow to deliver their weapons, were sitting ducks. Fieberling's 6 Avengers reached the Japanese fleet at 7:10 a.m. As they dropped to attack altitude and bored in toward the carriers, Zeros swarmed them like angry hornets. 2 Avengers were destroyed in the first pass. 3 more fell in quick succession. Only Ensign Albert K. Ernest's aircraft survived, and barely. Ernest's Avenger was shot to pieces. The controls were damaged, one wheel was shot away, the torpedo bay doors hung open, and the aircraft had been hit dozens of times. His turret gunner, Seaman First Class J.D. Manning, was dead. His radio man Third Class Harry Ferrier, was wounded. With hydraulics failing and his aircraft shaking itself apart, Ernest managed to launch his torpedo at a Japanese cruiser, then turned for Midway, flying by what he would later describe as Guess and by God. He made it back, landing his crippled Avenger with nothing but the trim tab for control. When the maintenance crews examined the aircraft, they stopped counting bullet holes after reaching 100. 5 of 6 Avengers lost on their first combat mission. No hits, no damage to enemy vessels. By any measure, it was a disaster. The rest of Torpedo Squadron 8, flying obsolete devastators from Hornet, fared even worse. All 15 were shot down with no survivors. The squadrons from Enterprise and Yorktown suffered similar fates. The torpedo attacks at Midway were a bloodbath, and the brand new TBF Avenger appeared to be just as vulnerable as the aircraft it was meant to replace. Naval aviation analysts examining the results were pessimistic. If the Avenger couldn't survive combat, what hope was there? But amid the wreckage and casualty lists, a few observers noticed something important. Ernest's aircraft had survived. Despite catastrophic damage that would have torn most aircraft apart, the Avenger had brought its crew home, or most of them anyway. The rugged construction, the armor protection, the sheer structural strength of the design had allowed it to absorb punishment that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. This resilience would become the Avenger's defining characteristic. More Avengers reached the fleet throughout the summer of 1942, and the aircraft began to redeem itself. At the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24th, 24 TBFs operating from the carriers Saratoga and Enterprise managed to sink the Japanese light carrier Ryujo and shoot down a dive bomber, losing 7 of their own. It wasn't a sterling victory, but it was progress. The pilots were learning how to use the aircraft, and more importantly, they were learning when not to use it for suicidal low-level torpedo runs. In November, Avengers from both Navy and Marine Corps squadrons helped sink the Japanese battleship He during the naval battle of Guadalcanal. The big torpedo bomber was starting to prove its worth as more than just a death trap, but the Avenger's greatest contribution to the war effort would come not in the Pacific, but in the cold, grey waters of the Atlantic Ocean, and it would come in a role that nobody had originally envisioned for the portly torpedo bomber. It would become a submarine killer. In early 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was reaching a critical phase. German U-boats operating in wolf packs were sinking Allied merchant ships faster than they could be replaced. The convoys that carried vital supplies to Britain and the Soviet Union were being decimated. Worse, the U-boats operated with near impunity. They could surface to recharge batteries and attack convoys, knowing that land-based patrol aircraft couldn't cover the entire Atlantic. There was a gap in the mid-ocean where no air cover existed, and the U-boats exploited it ruthlessly. The Allies desperately needed a way to put aircraft over convoys throughout their entire voyage. The answer was the escort carrier, small, slow, converted merchant ships that could carry a limited number of aircraft. And the aircraft they carried would be TBF Avengers. The first American escort carrier committed to anti-submarine warfare in the Atlantic was USS Bogue. Commissioned in September 1942, she was converted from a merchant hull, with a short flight deck, minimal defences, and accommodations for about 20 aircraft. Typically, she carried 9 F-4F Wildcat fighters for protection, and 12 TBF-1 Avengers configured for anti-submarine patrol. The Avengers carried depth charges instead of torpedoes, and many were fitted with radar for detecting surfaced submarines. Composite Squadron 9, under Lieutenant Commander William Drain, embarked aboard Bogue in early 1943 and began training for their new mission. On March 5, 1943, Bogue departed for her first operational patrol, escorting convoy HX-228 across the North Atlantic. The crossing was uneventful until March 10th, when one of her Avengers spotted a U-boat on the surface. Ensign McCausland made 2 attack passes, but his depth charges failed to release. The submarine escaped. It was a frustrating beginning, but lessons were learned. Mechanical issues were identified and fixed. Tactics were refined. The air crews gained experience. Over the next 2 months, Bogue made several more convoy runs, learning the trade of submarine hunting. Then came May 1943, and everything changed. Bogue was escorting convoy On 184 on its return voyage from Britain, when the convoy came under attack from Wolfpack Mosul, 21 U-boats coordinating their assault. This was exactly the kind of massed attack that had been tearing convoys apart. On May 21st at twilight, Lieutenant Commander Drain was flying patrol about 60 miles ahead of the convoy when his radar operator picked up a contact. U-231, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Wolfgang Wenzel, was running on the surface positioning for an attack. Drain pushed his Avenger into a shallow dive and released 4 depth bombs directly over the submarine's conning tower as it crash dived. The attack wrecked U-231's bridge and damaged her radio transmitters. Chlorine gas from damaged batteries forced the boat to abort its patrol and limp back to France. It was the first successful attack by a Bogue aircraft, but it was only the beginning. The next day, May 22nd, with the Wolfpack still pressing the attack, multiple Bogue Avengers launched to hunt the submarines. 4 different U-boats were attacked that day. U-305 was damaged, but the kill went to Lieutenant Junior Grade William F. Chamberlain, who caught U-569 on the surface and dropped his depth charges with deadly accuracy. The submarine was so badly damaged that her captain, Oberleutnant Hans-Peter Hinch, ordered the crew to scuttle. 24 survivors were picked up by Canadian destroyers. It was Bogue's first confirmed kill, and it demonstrated that the hunter-killer concept could work. Over the next 2 years, Bogue and her Avengers became a nightmare for the Kriegsmarine. Operating as the centre of a hunter-killer group that included several destroyers and destroyer escorts, Bogue would detach from convoys and hunt aggressively in areas where intelligence indicated U-boats were operating. Her aircraft could cover vast areas of ocean, their radar detecting surface submarines that would otherwise be invisible. Once located, the Avengers would attack with depth charges, forcing the U-boat to dive, then vectoring in surface ships to continue the attack. The coordination between air and surface forces proved devastatingly effective. On June 5, 1943, Avengers from Bogue sank U-217 in the mid-Atlantic. On June 12th, 8 Avengers caught U-118 on the surface and tore her apart with depth charges and gunfire, killing most of her crew. On July 23rd, U-527 went down under Avenger attack. The kills kept coming. U-172 was sunk after a 27-hour running battle. U-850 was destroyed by Fido homing torpedoes, a new acoustic weapon that could actually chase submarines underwater. U-1229 was caught and killed southeast of Newfoundland. The Fido torpedo, officially designated the Mark 24, but called a mine for secrecy, was a revolution in anti-submarine warfare. Dropped by parachute from an Avenger, it would activate upon entering the water and home in on the sound of a submarine's propellers. U-boat captains had no warning, no way to evade. One moment they thought they were safe underwater, the next their boat was being torn apart by explosions. The psychological impact on German submariners was profound. The Avenger, with its long-endurance, stable platform and large weapons bay capable of carrying multiple Fidos, became the perfect delivery system for this terrifying weapon. But the Avenger's most spectacular kill in the Atlantic would come not against a German submarine, but a Japanese one. In June 1944, American intelligence learned that the Japanese submarine I-52 was attempting to reach occupied France carrying a cargo of strategic materials. Gold, mercury, tungsten, optical instruments, everything Japan needed from Germany and Germany needed from Japan. The cargo submarine rendezvoused with the German U-530 on June 23rd in the mid-Atlantic to pick up a pilot who would guide her into port. Allied intelligence had been tracking the submarine's every move through decoded messages. Within hours of the rendezvous, the information reached USS Bogue. Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor immediately launched in his Avenger to hunt the Japanese boat. Flying through darkness, guided only by his radar operator Chief Ed Whitlock, Taylor searched for hours. Then Whitlock picked up a blip. They went after it, dropping flares that lit up the 350-foot cargo submarine. Taylor dove in and dropped 2 depth charges. I-52 crash-dived, and Taylor dropped a sonobuoy, a new device that could pick up underwater sounds and transmit them back to the carrier. The sonobuoy detected the submarine, and Taylor followed, dropping a Fido torpedo. The acoustic torpedo found its target. I-52, with her entire crew of 95 and her valuable cargo, plunged to the bottom of the Atlantic. She wouldn't be found again until 1995, lying in over 3 miles of water. By the end of the war, American escort carrier groups, primarily equipped with Avengers, had sunk or assisted in sinking 35 German U-boats in the Atlantic. British escort carriers using Avengers supplied through Lend-Lease added several more to the tally. The effectiveness was staggering. The TBF Avenger, designed as a torpedo bomber to attack surface ships, had been transformed into the most effective submarine killer in the Allied arsenal. The aircraft's long range meant it could stay on patrol for hours. Its stable flight characteristics made it an excellent platform for radar and visual search. Its large weapons bay could carry a variety of ordnance, from depth charges to homing torpedoes to sonobuoys, and its rugged construction meant it could operate in the brutal weather conditions of the North Atlantic, where lesser aircraft would have been grounded. The statistics tell the story. With nearly 10,000 Avengers delivered and over 46,000 combat sorties flown, only 729 aircraft were lost to all causes. Of those, just 47 were lost in aerial combat. The vast majority of losses came from anti-aircraft fire, with 422 aircraft shot down by flak and operational accidents, with 260 lost to mechanical failures, bad landings and other non-combat causes. The Avenger's survival rate was extraordinary, testament to both its rugged construction and the effectiveness of the tactics developed to employ it. One pilot would later say that with nearly 10,000 Avengers delivered, the type could be considered one of the safest places to be in World War II. While Avengers were hunting U-boats in the Atlantic, others were returning to their original role in the Pacific, though with modified tactics that reflected hard-won lessons. After the disaster at Midway, torpedo attacks became increasingly rare. Japanese anti-aircraft defences improved dramatically, and the vulnerability of torpedo bombers making low, slow runs was simply too great. Instead, Avengers were increasingly used as conventional bombers, carrying heavy bomb loads and attacking from medium altitude. They were also discovered to be surprisingly effective as glide bombers, diving from moderate altitude at angles between 45 and 60 degrees, releasing their bombs at about 2,500 feet. The relatively shallow dive didn't require the specialized dive brakes and reinforced structure of true dive bombers, but the accuracy was far superior to level bombing. Some Avengers even lowered their landing gear during glide bombing attacks to act as improvised dive brakes, though this practice was discouraged after several aircraft came apart under the stress. The big torpedo bomber proved adaptable to an astonishing range of missions. Avengers flew reconnaissance, using their long range to scout far ahead of the fleet. They served as command aircraft for air group commanders, with their good radio facilities and spacious cockpit making them ideal for coordinating complex strikes. They flew medical evacuation missions, carrying wounded Marines and soldiers from forward positions. They even served as cargo aircraft, airdropping supplies to isolated units. During the battle for Okinawa, Avengers dropped water, food, and ammunition to the 1st Marine Regiment trapped at Shuri Castle. But when the opportunity presented itself, Avengers still delivered torpedoes with devastating effect. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Avengers from escort carriers made repeated torpedo runs against the Japanese fleet, including the super battleship Yamato. Though many torpedoes missed or failed to detonate, enough found their targets to slow the Japanese advance and contribute to the eventual American victory. In the final months of the war, Avengers participated in the attacks that sank both Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, the two largest battleships ever built. The irony was not lost on observers. The portly torpedo bomber that had been nearly wiped out at Midway had helped destroy the most powerful surface ships in the Japanese Navy. Production of the Avenger had become an industrial marvel in its own right. By 1943, demand for the aircraft far exceeded Grumman's capacity, especially as the company shifted focus to producing the F-6F Hellcat fighter. The solution was to bring in General Motors. The automotive giant, with its car factories idled by wartime production restrictions, was looking for ways to contribute to the war effort. Grumman provided them with detailed plans and several so-called PK aircraft, non-flying airframes held together with Parker-Kalin sheet metal screws that could be easily disassembled and studied. GM engineers took these aircraft apart, studied every component, and redesigned the Avenger for mass production using automotive manufacturing techniques. The result was the TBM, the General Motors version of the Avenger, produced by GM's Eastern Aircraft Division in plants scattered across New York, New Jersey, and Maryland. By war's end, Eastern Aircraft had produced 7,546 TBMs, 3/4 of all Avengers built. The total production run reached 9,139 aircraft, an astonishing number for such a large, complex machine. The Wright R2600 engine alone contained 2,400 individual components, machined to tolerances of thousandths of an inch. Each aircraft required 65,000 individual parts, 8 miles of electrical wiring, 2,000 pounds of aluminum, and 300 pounds of rubber. Yet American workers, many of them women who had never seen an aircraft before Pearl Harbor, assembled these complex machines with precision that equaled or exceeded peacetime standards. The later TBM-3 variant, which entered production in mid-1944, featured the more powerful R2600-20 engine, producing plus 900 horsepower, improved avionics, and provisions for wing-mounted rockets. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rocket, or HVAR, nicknamed Holy Moses by pilots, was essentially a 105mm artillery shell fitted with a rocket motor. A single Avenger could carry 10 of these weapons, giving it firepower equivalent to a destroyer's broadside. When the first rocket attack against a submarine was made in January 1944, with Avengers from USS Block Island attacking U-758, it marked yet another evolution in the aircraft's capabilities. Though U-758 survived that particular attack and made it back to port, the message was clear. Submarines were no longer safe even when submerged. Avengers could detect them with sonar buoys, track them with radar, and attack them with homing torpedoes and now rockets. Operation Leader, that strike against Norwegian convoys on October 4, 1943, demonstrated yet another aspect of the Avenger's versatility. The 10 TBMs that launched from USS Ranger that morning were loaded with bombs, not torpedoes. Their mission was to attack shipping in harbour, not on the open ocean. Flying in formation with SBD Dauntless dive bombers and escorted by F-4F Wildcat fighters, the Avengers approached their targets near Sandnessjøen, achieving complete surprise. The Norwegian coastline, with its fjords and mountains, provided cover for the final approach. At 6:34 a.m., the Avengers began their attack runs. One by one, they dove on the German and Norwegian vessels crowded in the harbour. Bombs smashed into cargo ships and tankers. The Avengers then came around for strafing runs, their wing-mounted 50-caliber machine guns raking the decks of damaged ships. The northern group attacking Bodø Harbour achieved similar success. When the smoke cleared, at least 5 ships had been sunk, including the steamship Rabat and the freighter Vegan. 7 more ships were damaged, some so badly they had to be beached to prevent sinking. The massive tanker Schleswig was so heavily damaged she was out of action for months. The cost to the Americans was relatively light. 3 aircraft were lost to anti-aircraft fire and operational accidents, with 5 airmen killed. But the mission had accomplished its objectives. German convoy operations in the region were disrupted for weeks. Critical iron ore shipments were delayed, and the operation proved that American carrier forces could strike anywhere, even in the heavily defended waters of occupied Europe. For the crews of the Avengers, it was vindication. The aircraft that had nearly been written off after Midway had just conducted the only US Navy carrier operation north of the Arctic Circle in the entire war. One of the American pilots would later say, "We went in as boys and came out as men." The Avenger had proven itself in yet another role, this time as a tactical bomber attacking shore installations and shipping in harbour. The British Fleet Air Arm received 958 Avengers through Lend-Lease, initially designating them as Tarpon before switching to the American name in early 1944. British Avengers saw action in both the Atlantic and Pacific, operating from escort carriers on convoy protection duty and from fleet carriers during strikes against Japanese targets in Southeast Asia. While the British preferred their venerable Fairey Swordfish biplane for operations from small escort carrier decks, the Avenger proved its worth in the British infantry as well. Number 846 Squadron, operating from HMS Tracker, became the Fleet Air Arm's most successful Avenger unit, sinking or helping to sink 3 German U-boats during Arctic convoy operations in 1944. By 1944, as American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, Avengers took on yet another role. As Japanese fleet units became scarce, the TBMs shifted to ground support missions, using their heavy bomb loads and rocket armament to support Marine and Army operations. The aircraft's ability to loiter over the battlefield for extended periods, its heavy weapons load and its rugged construction made it ideal for close air support. During the invasions of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, Avengers provided critical support to ground forces, attacking enemy positions, destroying artillery emplacements, and interdicting Japanese supply lines. The big torpedo bomber had become a true multi-role aircraft, equally at home hunting submarines, attacking shipping, or providing close air support to troops on the ground. One of the most famous Avenger pilots was a young naval aviator named George Herbert Walker Bush. Fresh out of training at age 19, Bush was assigned to VT-51 aboard the light carrier USS San Jacinto. On September 2, 1944, Bush was flying a mission against Japanese installations on the island of Chichijima when his Avenger was hit by anti-aircraft fire. Despite heavy damage and fire erupting in the cockpit, Bush completed his attack, striking the target before turning out to sea. He ordered his crew to bail out, but only Bush's parachute deployed successfully. His two crewmates, turret gunner Aviation Radioman Second Class John Delaney and Radioman Lieutenant Junior Grade William White, went down with the aircraft. Bush landed in the water and was rescued after 4 hours by the submarine USS Finback, which had been positioned as a lifeguard for downed aircrews. Bush would fly 58 combat missions in his Avenger and be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Decades later, when the 41st President of the United States passed away in 2018, a touching editorial cartoon showed Bush arriving in heaven in his Avenger to reunite with his lost crew and his late wife Barbara. As the war wound down in 1945, the Avenger's role began to shift once again. With Japanese naval power largely destroyed and U-boat operations in the Atlantic reduced to a trickle, many TBMs were modified for specialized roles. The TBM-3W became an airborne early warning aircraft, fitted with a large ventral radome containing search radar. These aircraft could detect enemy aircraft at long range and vector fighters to intercept them, providing the fleet with vital early warning capability. The TBM-3S was configured specifically for anti-submarine warfare, with enhanced radar and sonar buoy equipment. Some Avengers were even converted to carry electronic countermeasures equipment, jamming enemy radar and communications. The adaptability that had made the Avenger successful as a torpedo bomber, then a submarine hunter, then a conventional bomber, now made it valuable as a platform for specialized electronics that couldn't easily fit in smaller aircraft. When the war ended in August 1945, 9,837 Avengers had been delivered. Production ceased immediately, with hundreds of aircraft on order cancelled. But unlike many wartime aircraft that quickly faded into obsolescence, the Avenger continued to serve for years. The outbreak of the Korean War in 1950 saw Avengers return to combat, though in limited roles. They flew night attack missions, anti-submarine patrols, and provided logistical support. But by the mid-1950s, more advanced aircraft like the Douglas AD Sky Raider were replacing the aging Avengers in frontline squadrons. The last US Navy Avengers were retired from active service in 1954, though some continued to fly in reserve units until 1957. The Royal Canadian Navy became one of the last major operators of the Avenger, acquiring 125 surplus TBM-3Es between 1950 and 1952. With the Cold War intensifying and the threat from Soviet submarines growing, Canada needed capable anti-submarine aircraft for North Atlantic patrols. 98 Canadian Avengers were extensively modified with new radar systems, electronic countermeasures equipment, sonar buoys, and magnetic anomaly detectors. These AS-3 and AS-3M variants represented the ultimate evolution of the Avengers' anti-submarine capabilities, but even these were eventually replaced by the more modern Grumman S-2 tracker, and the last Canadian Avengers were retired in 1960, ending the type's military service. Many surplus Avengers found new life in civilian roles. Their large size, powerful engine, and sturdy construction made them ideal for conversion to water bombers for fighting forest fires. The US Forest Service purchased several in 1956, and TBMs fought fires across North America for decades. Some are still flying today, more than 80 years after the type first entered service. Other Avengers were preserved in museums or restored to flying condition by warbird enthusiasts. The distinctive sound of that big Wright Cyclone engine, the throaty roar that once struck fear into U-boat crews, can still be heard at air shows around the world. Looking back at the Avengers war record, the transformation is remarkable. An aircraft that lost 5 of 6 on its first combat mission became one of the war's most successful and versatile platforms. It sank 30 submarines, more than any other aircraft type. It helped destroy the largest battleships ever built. It flew over 46,000 combat sorties while suffering relatively light losses. It served in every major theatre of the war, from the Arctic Circle to the South Pacific, from the coast of Norway to the beaches of Okinawa. It was produced in greater numbers than any American torpedo bomber, and it remained in service longer than virtually any other World War II combat aircraft. The Avenger wasn't fast. It wasn't agile. It wasn't sleek or elegant, but it was tough, reliable, adaptable, and effective. In the end, those qualities mattered more than speed or grace. The men who flew the Avenger developed a deep affection for the big torpedo bomber. They trusted it to bring them home, and it usually did. Pilots spoke of its stability, its reliability, its ability to absorb punishment and keep flying. Crews appreciated the comfortable cockpit, the good visibility, the solid feel of the controls. It flew like a truck, they said, but it was their truck, and they wouldn't have traded it for anything. When an Avenger was hit, it might shudder, it might smoke, it might trail hydraulic fluid and fuel, but it kept flying. That toughness, built into every frame and bulkhead, saved countless lives. The industrial achievement represented by the Avenger program was equally impressive. Two companies, Grumman and General Motors, produced nearly 10,000 complex aircraft in just 3 years. The coordination required to manufacture tens of thousands of components to exacting specifications, assemble them into airframes, install equally complex engines, fit them with electronics and weapon systems, and deliver them to combat units around the world was a logistical triumph. Each aircraft represented thousands of hours of labour by workers who understood that the quality of their work could mean life or death for the crews who would fly these machines into combat. The fact that Avengers proved so reliable in service is a testament to the skill and dedication of those workers. From a strategic perspective, the Avengers' contribution to Allied victory was profound. In the Atlantic, Avengers flying from escort carriers closed the mid-ocean gap that U-boats had exploited so effectively. The hunter-killer groups built around these aircraft, and their carriers turned the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. By making the ocean too dangerous for U-boats to operate on the surface, they forced German submarines to remain submerged where they were slower, nearly blind, and far less effective. The impact on the German submarine campaign was catastrophic. Monthly sinking totals, which had reached terrifying heights in early 1943, plummeted as more escort carriers and their Avengers reached the Atlantic. By mid-1943, Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, was forced to withdraw his submarines from the North Atlantic entirely, a tacit admission that the Battle of the Atlantic had been lost. The convoys got through, Britain remained supplied, the build-up for D-Day proceeded on schedule, and TBF Avengers had played a central role in making it all possible. In the Pacific, the Avengers' contribution was more subtle but no less important. While fighters like the F-6F Hellcat won air superiority, and dive bombers like the SBD Dauntless struck with precision, the Avenger provided the heavy punch. Its ability to carry a 2,000-pound bomb load made it the strike force's hammer, capable of inflicting catastrophic damage on ships, installations and ground targets. The aircraft's range allowed carrier task forces to strike targets hundreds of miles away, extending American naval power across vast stretches of ocean. When combined with fighters and dive bombers in coordinated strikes, the Avenger formed one leg of a three-pronged attack that Japanese defences found nearly impossible to counter effectively. The sheer flexibility of the aircraft meant that task force commanders could adapt their strike packages to whatever targets presented themselves, confident that their Avengers could deliver the necessary ordnance. The Avenger also played a crucial but often overlooked role in the development of naval aviation tactics and technology. The aircraft served as a testbed for innovations that would shape carrier aviation for decades to come. The electrically powered turret pioneered on the TBF influenced defensive armament systems on subsequent aircraft. The internal weapons bay demonstrated the advantages of clean aerodynamics and influenced bomber design philosophy. The integration of radar, sonobuoys, and other sensors into a combat aircraft helped establish the concept of the sensor-equipped strike aircraft that would dominate Cold War naval aviation. The hunter-killer tactics developed by Avenger-equipped escort carriers in the Atlantic became the foundation for anti-submarine warfare doctrine that remained relevant well into the Jet Age. Perhaps most significantly, the Avenger demonstrated the value of the multi-role combat aircraft. Before the war, naval doctrine envisioned specialized aircraft for specific missions, fighters for air combat, dive bombers for precision strikes, and torpedo bombers for attacking ships. The Avenger proved that a well-designed aircraft could excel in multiple roles, carrying bombs one day, torpedoes the next, and depth charges the day after that. This flexibility allowed carriers to adjust their air groups based on the mission, loading more fighters if air superiority was the priority, or more strike aircraft if surface targets were the focus. The concept of the multi-role strike aircraft, which would reach full expression in jets like the A-6 Intruder and later the FA-18 Hornet, had its roots in the adaptability of the TBF Avenger. The human stories behind the statistics are equally compelling. Thousands of young men, many barely out of their teens, climbed into Avengers and flew off into uncertainty. Some never returned. The 729 Avengers lost in combat represented not just aircraft, but the lives of hundreds of aircrew who went down with them. Each loss meant 3 families receiving Western Union telegrams, 3 sets of parents grieving, 3 communities mourning. Yet the survivors spoke not of the losses, but of the camaraderie, the sense of purpose, the conviction that they were fighting for something that mattered. They remembered the friends they lost, but they also remembered the missions completed, the ships sunk, the convoys protected, the battles won. The bond between Avenger crews was particularly strong, perhaps because of the aircraft's 3-man crew configuration. Unlike single-seat fighters where pilots flew alone, Avenger crews depended on each other completely. The pilot relied on his radioman to navigate, to operate the radar, to handle communications. Both relied on the turret gunner to protect them from attacking fighters. All 3 trusted their lives to the other's skill and courage. Crew assignments were taken seriously, and once a crew was formed, they typically stayed together throughout their combat tour. They trained together, flew together, survived or died together. The shared experience of cramming into that big torpedo bomber, taking off from a pitching carrier deck, flying into danger, and making it back created bonds that lasted lifetimes. Reunions of Avenger squadrons decades after the war always drew strong attendance as aging veterans gathered to remember their youth, their service, and their fallen comrades. The Avenger also played a role in the integration of women into the American workforce. With so many men in uniform, aircraft factories desperately needed workers. Women, many of whom had never held jobs outside the home, flocked to defense plants. At the General Motors Eastern Aircraft Division plants, women made up a substantial portion of the workforce, performing every job from riveting to final assembly. They built engines, installed electrical systems, fitted weapons mounts, and inspected completed aircraft. The famous Rosie the Riveter posters might have shown women working on bombers, but many real-life Rosies were building Avengers. These women proved that gender was no barrier to industrial work, and while many returned to traditional roles after the war, others continued working, blazing trails for future generations. The Avenger they built became a symbol not just of American military might, but of American industrial democracy, where citizens of all backgrounds contributed to the war effort. The aircraft's service with Allied nations also deserves recognition. Beyond the British Fleet Air Arm's extensive use of the type, New Zealand's Royal New Zealand Air Force operated Avengers in the Pacific, flying strikes against Japanese positions in the Solomon Islands and supporting the advance toward Rabaul. The Netherlands received Avengers for the Royal Netherlands Naval Air Service, using them in operations against Japanese forces in the Dutch East Indies. After the war, France operated Avengers from the carrier Aramanchis during the First Indochina War, using them for ground support missions against Viet Minh forces. Japan, ironically, would eventually operate surplus Avengers in the 1950s, after the formation of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, using them for anti-submarine training. The widespread international service of the Avenger testified to its fundamental soundness as a design and its adaptability to different operational needs. The Avenger's influence extended beyond its own service life. Engineers who worked on the TBF went on to design the next generation of naval aircraft, carrying lessons learned into new projects. The emphasis on ruggedness, the value of defensive armament, the importance of crew protection, the benefits of internal weapons carriage, all these lessons shaped subsequent designs. The Grumman A-6 Intruder, which served the Navy from the 1960s through the 1990s, bore a clear philosophical lineage to the Avenger, a subsonic straight-wing attack aircraft that prioritized payload, range, and survivability over speed and agility. The EA-6B Prowler electronic warfare aircraft, derived from the Intruder, continued the tradition of using a large, stable airframe as a platform for specialized equipment, much as the TBM-3W had done 2 decades earlier. The legacy of the Avenger in popular culture has been more muted than that of more glamorous types like the P-51 Mustang or F-4U Corsair, but it has endured. The aircraft's most infamous moment came in December 1945, when Flight 19, a training flight of 5 TBM Avengers from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale disappeared over the Atlantic. The mystery of their disappearance, never satisfactorily explained despite extensive searches, became one of the foundational legends of the Bermuda Triangle phenomenon. While the reality was almost certainly a combination of navigational error, bad weather, and fuel exhaustion, the story captured public imagination and ensured that the Avenger remained in the public consciousness long after more successful missions had been forgotten. In aviation museums around the world, preserved Avengers stand as monuments to the men who flew them and the era that produced them. At the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, a beautifully restored TBM-3E sits in splendor, its blue-grey paint gleaming, its markings crisp. At the USS Midway Museum in San Diego, visitors can walk up to a TBM and peer into the cockpit, imagining what it must have been like to fly such a machine into combat. At the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton, Ontario, a flying TBM-3E still takes to the skies, its Wright Cyclone engine producing that distinctive roar, reminding audiences of the sound that once filled the skies over the Atlantic and Pacific. The technical specifications of the Avenger, impressive for 1942, seem almost quaint by modern standards. Maximum speed of 275 miles per hour, service ceiling of 30,000 feet, range of 1,000 miles with a full weapons load. These numbers pale in comparison to modern strike aircraft that can fly twice as fast, twice as high, and twice as far. But context matters. In 1942, these capabilities represented a quantum leap over the aircraft the Avenger replaced. The TBD Devastator it superseded could barely exceed 200 miles per hour and had a range of less than 700 miles. The improvement was transformational, giving the Navy a weapon system that could actually accomplish its missions with a reasonable chance of survival. The economics of the Avenger program also merit attention. The total cost of the Avenger program, including development, production, and support, ran to approximately $2.3 billion in 1940s dollars, equivalent to perhaps $35 billion today. That works out to roughly $234,000 per aircraft, a substantial sum but dramatically less expensive than contemporary heavy bombers or battleships. A single Iowa-class battleship cost nearly $110 million to build, the equivalent of 468 Avengers. Yet those Avengers, properly employed, could sink that battleship or hunt down the submarines threatening it, or support the amphibious operations that would capture the islands the battleship was meant to bombard. The return on investment was extraordinary. The Avenger wasn't just effective militarily, it was cost-effective, delivering combat capability at a price the nation could afford even while fighting a two-front war. The story of the TBF Avenger is ultimately a story about the nature of military effectiveness. It's not always the fastest, most advanced, or most sophisticated weapon that proves most valuable. Sometimes it's the weapon that's good enough, reliable enough, and adaptable enough to handle whatever missions it's assigned. The Avenger was never the best aircraft at any single role. There were faster torpedo bombers, though not many. There were more accurate dive bombers. There were patrol aircraft with longer range. But no single aircraft combined all these capabilities in one package as effectively as the Avenger. Its jack-of-all-trades versatility, once seen as a compromise, became its greatest strength. The Avenger also exemplifies the American approach to weapons development during World War II. Rapid prototyping, quick production, continuous improvement, and pragmatic adaptation to battlefield realities. When the aircraft's forward armament proved inadequate, the problem was fixed with the wing gun modification. When torpedoes proved too vulnerable to deliver, the aircraft was employed as a bomber. When submarines became the priority target, the Avenger became a submarine hunter. This flexibility, this willingness to use weapons in ways never originally envisioned, characterized American military operations throughout the war and contributed significantly to Allied victory. For the generation that fought World War II, now rapidly passing into history, the Avenger remained a symbol of their youth, their service, and their sacrifice. The surviving veterans, now in their late 90s or beyond, still light up when they see an Avenger at an air show or museum. They remember the smell of the cockpit, a mixture of hydraulic fluid, oil, and the distinctive odor of the life raft. They remember the sound of the engine starting, the cough and sputter before the big radial caught and roared to life. They remember the view from the cockpit during a catapult launch, the sudden acceleration, the momentary weightlessness, then the steady climb away from the deck. They remember their crewmates, the men with whom they shared the most intense experiences of their lives, and they remember the aircraft that carried them through it all, brought most of them home, and became as much a part of their identity as their uniforms or their service records. In the final analysis, the Grumman TBF and General Motors TBM Avenger stands as one of the great success stories of World War II aviation. Born in crisis, bloodied in its first battle, written off by some as another failed design, it instead became one of the war's most versatile and effective aircraft. It hunted submarines in the Arctic and the Atlantic. It bombed ships in Norwegian fjords. It torpedoed battleships in the Pacific. It supported Marines on Okinawa and army troops in the Philippines. It served with a dozen nations. It remained in frontline service for nearly 20 years and in specialized roles even longer. Nearly 10,000 were built, and while most ended their days in scrapyards, the survivors that remain serve as tangible links to a time when the world hung in the balance and young men climbed into aircraft like the Avenger to do their part. The thunder that rolled across carrier decks when Avengers launched for combat missions has long since faded. The roar of massed formations heading for target has been replaced by the quiet of museums and the occasional appearance at airshows. But the legacy endures, in the tactics manual that guide modern naval aviation, in the multi-role aircraft that now fly from carrier decks, in the submarine hunting techniques that protected Allied shipping, and in the memories of the men who flew the big torpedo bomber into harm's way and brought it home again, carrying with them not just their own survival, but the hope and determination of a nation at war. The Avenger was never meant to be elegant. It was meant to be effective, and in that mission, it succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. From the depths of defeat at Midway to the heights of victory over the Atlantic and Pacific, the TBF Avenger proved that sometimes the most important qualities in a weapon aren't speed or sophistication, but reliability, adaptability, and the ability to do the job when it matters most. That's the true legacy of the Turkey, the aircraft that looked like it had swallowed a truck but flew like it had swallowed the determination of everyone who built it, and everyone who flew it. In the long history of naval aviation, few aircraft have earned their place more thoroughly than the Grumman TBF Avenger.